Welcome to the New Human Movement. I'm Michele Zanini, and today Gary Hamel and I are delighted to be in dialogue with Tiziana Casciaro. Tiziana is a professor of organizational behavior at the Rotman School of Management in Toronto. Her research has been featured in many leading publications, including The Economist, The Financial Times, The Washington Post, and the Harvard Business Review. She's the author, with Julie Battilana, of a wonderful new book called Power for All. And here it is. Really awesome book. And Tiziana, I wanted to welcome to the New Human Movement. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me. I just want to say that I'm wearing red in honor of your book. You see, even though I realize that it's not exactly the same shade, so I apologize for the faux pas fashion-wise, but the intention was very good.
All right, beautiful. Thanks for that. We coordinated it perfectly. So let's get right into it and start with the first word of your book's title, power. So how do you and Julie define that term, power?
Oh, it's a simple definition. Power is the ability to influence the behavior of others. Basically, providing them with either incentives or motivations or purpose or coercion that leads them to behave in a way that you would like them to behave. And the question is, where does that ability come from? And our definition of the origin of the ability to influence others resides in control over resources others value. So you can influence them if you have something they need or want, and if they cannot get it easily elsewhere. And that opens up all kinds of different twists and turns in the road to power, because what people need and want is quite varied and complex. And your own work on humanocracy is actually helping us understand what are those needs and those desires that are very human that animate not only a well-functioning organization, but also our power relationships in it. So much to explore there.
Yeah, no, and we'll definitely unpack a lot of these things. But one of the things that you mention is coercion, and that's just one of the many things that can help lead people to change other people's behaviors. But often in our and you mentioned this, you and Julie, in the book, that we often give that too much weight. That we correlate formal authority with power, and that's a misconception or overly narrow definition of what power is. I was hoping you could unpack that a little bit more. What is the difference between authority and positional authority and power?
Yeah, it's an important distinction to make, because people are not wrong in assuming that authority is, in fact, a form of power. If you go back to the definition, power comes from control over resources that people value. And as somebody of high rank in a hierarchical organization, you have control over something that employees value. It's access to a promotion, access to a certain level of pay. The manager can decide whether you keep your job or lose your job, what kind of job you have. So in a traditional organization, there is, in fact, control over valued resources in a position of high rank. The problem with that definition, though, that equating authority and power, is that it misses all kinds of other resources that people value that are not, in fact, under the control of people of higher rank formally. So the boss that assumes that just because they're the boss, they're going to be able to boss people around, so the coercion piece of it all, is often so surprised to see that you get a promotion, you feel like you should be able to tell people what to do, and people don't do it. I think in your book, you do say something along the lines of, in the Nucor case, something like authority is given by the employees to the manager, right? And that goes back to, are you really construing influence in the right way, because you are delivering something to the employees that they want and value, and therefore they will respond to your attempts at influence. But if you are not, if you're very confused about what they need and want, you will not be able to influence them, despite your title.
And Tiziana, you make the point repeatedly that there's fairly low correlation between influence and power and rank, right, in organizations. And you mentioned work that you and Julie did at the National Health Service, which is a large public healthcare organization in the UK. And so perhaps you can talk a little bit about some of your research and what you found there, and how that is a little bit counterintuitive to people that do hold that fairly traditional view, right, of power being conferred in position.
Yeah, that's an interesting example because the National Health Service is highly, highly bureaucratic. First of all, it's a huge institution that employs 1 million people. So anything that big, is likely to become highly layered in terms of levels of authority and responsibility, span of control, all of those traditional things. And what we were looking at is the ability of people to create change in an environment of that kind that is desperately needing change, but often unable to pull it off. And we observed 68 change agents, each one who took it upon themselves to say, this thing is not working. Let's actually do it something in another way. And so very, very much kind of bottom up in the sense that, truly emergent change initiatives. And we were curious to see who succeeds and who doesn't in that kind of environment. And we thought that authority might have some contribution because, as we said earlier, I do have something as coming at me in terms of control over resources people value based on my rank. What we found is that the level in the formal structure of these change agents had zero predictive ability in terms of the capacity to implement their change initiative. Not a little, not less than other things, none. Okay, that was the more surprising fact. And then I have to, full disclosure, we didn't look at people at the bottom of the formal hierarchy because they didn't even try to create change. Unlike the people you describe in many of the cases in your books, where you have people that at the bottom who are completely comfortable, initiating something. These guys did not. But we had from middle management to top management. And in that range, the level of hierarchical rank did not influence the outcome. What influenced the outcome was the network of the change agent. So this is the more emergent connections that people develop. And why do they develop them? They develop them because they got something to offer to others. They flock to them. And the things that they offer vary. It could be pure information. They understand the organization really well. They know what to do. They know what not to do. They are able to provide guidance to people. But they can also offer other things that are more psychological, a sense of possibility, a sense of purpose, a sense of autonomy, a sense of achievement. I am guiding you with this change initiative toward a world in which you, dear follower, are gonna be able to do more, to find the satisfaction, the pride in your work, serve more patients, do better. All of those things are very deeply valued resources. And what we found in this contest is that that's what the currency was. It was not in the formal rank. So one more demonstration of what we see all the time. Basically, if you are high up, don't have the illusion of power because you're often disappointed. If you are lower down, don't let that stop you from searching for pathways forward. Some organizations make it harder than others to do so, but the idea that you can rally the troops if you have the right thing to offer to them that matters to them is very much, we see it all the time in all of these environments, even the most bureaucratized ones.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, Tiziana, because I find something almost paradoxical there that I would love for you to kind of unpack for us. I think you have this experience, and so do we, that, we talk to a lot of leaders, quite senior leaders with a lot of positional authority, who are immensely frustrated by their inability to move the organization forward. They have, just a limited number of hours, a limited number of ways of influencing the organization. They feel that, they're often stymied by kind of quotes the system. Having said that, equally, people on the front lines feel very helpless as well, and we'll come back maybe and talk about that a bit more. But how can it be that at kind of both ends of the pyramid, people feel kind of impotent to move things forward? How do you explain that?
My explanation is that people don't spend enough time understanding what's valued, and they go for the wrong things, and they are not sophisticated enough in perceiving their environment and what people want to achieve, want to pursue, what deeply moves them. And they find themselves not being able to influence anybody, upward, downward, laterally. It doesn't really matter anymore because you haven't paid enough attention. You don't get it. And we are very restricted in what we think matters to people. And the typical are material resources that they do matter. Money does matter. It motivates a lot of action, for better or for worse, but it's not the only thing that goes on. So one of the things that I love about the cases you describe in your book is that you show that, yes, there are going to be monetary incentives that create certain motivations for people. But what keeps people in the game, in an organization in the long run, are often deeper and bigger things. A sense of safety, a sense that you are there to stay, that you're not going to be tossed away when the tide turns, that they're going to keep you because they value what you bring. They value the depth of your experience, of your understanding of the business. They value you. And that feeds your self-esteem, your sense that you're worth something. Those are deeper things than I'm getting a bonus or not, even though the bonus does matter. We do know that. But I think that a lot of managers and a lot of employees are mistaken in letting those very tangible resources drive the whole game. It's only a part of the game. And that's my interpretation of why they feel so powerless.
Okay, I have one follow-up, and then I want to change direction, and then back to Michele. So my follow-up is this. You're saying that often, more senior executives and others miss this sense of what's really important to people, self-esteem being very high on the list, as is autonomy and self-direction and agency. Those are hardly new ideas, right? I mean, this goes back a long ways in philosophy, in management theory. So why is it taking us so long to kind of understand that? And why do we default more to kind of the blunt use of positional power rather than taking the time, having the curiosity to really understand, how do I help this person achieve what they want to achieve? How do they look at this? Because that seems even now to still be more the exception, that point of view, than the rule.
Well, there's the other side of the coin of this need to feel safe and the need to feel like you're worth something. And the other side of the coin is that I can fulfill those needs through a sense of control over my world. And fear drives a lot of the behavior you're describing, Gary. In my view of this disconnect, we have thousands of years of human thought that describe human nature. And they do very, very well. From Aristotle, Epicurus, all the way through Shakespeare, Dante, our compatriot Michele. These are thinkers that have sorted it all out. And all we have to do is assemble it in a sensible way. We don't. Because my way as a leader to feel good about myself and feel protected from the threats of the world is to control you so that I get to have predictable behavior from people, including the prediction that you're not going to come into my turf and take stuff away from me and then make me feel less good about myself, less safe. So it's really we have to engage, and I know we think alike in many ways. I'm going to show your book again because I love it so much. I love your book. It's an education, I think, that we're trying to impart on leaders. So Julie and I thought initially, actually, that we thought we were writing this book primarily for people who have been frustrated in being unable to gain power. And so we wanted to, unpack it for them, give them a chance to have impact in the world the way they wanted to. And then over time, we are realizing more and more that we wrote it more for people who have power, because those are the ones who need to be enlightened about what power does and does not do, and how they should relate to it in a less insecure, fearful way. And a lot of our hoarding of power, once we attain it, is driven by insecurity and fear. You don't think it's possible that these folks out there, if you empower them, that they're going to use it well and they're not going to take things away from you. So we think of power as a zero-sum game. Huge, enormous misconception. If there is a piece of evidence before us, it is that, in fact, much of the ill that occurs in our organizations comes from great power disparities, because they make it impossible for the folks that you talk about, the folks with ideas, the folks with an understanding of the customer, the folks with an understanding of the machine that I'm trying to use or the product I'm trying to build. Those guys have a lot to offer, and make it absolutely impossible for them to do so in a very unequal system power-wise. And this is true at the societal level. Very, very asymmetric.
Let me take you back though for a moment to what your original audience in a way, and let me throw out a hypothetical, because one thing I found quite helpful is you have a very clear way of thinking about what are the ways of rebalancing power in a particular situation. And you talk about attraction, expansion, consolidation, and withdrawal. And I have to say, I'm sure this isn't what you intended, but as I was reading this, I was thinking about many, many years ago when I was in the dating pool, and I was thinking about how I got more influence over whoever had my eye on. And I realized I used all of those strategies. I'm not proud of all of them, but anyway, I'm not going to unpack that further. But I can tell you mostly they work. But let me give you a hypothetical, Tiziana. I'd like you to think about somebody named Jennifer. Jennifer's working in a really brilliant software company. She's a really smart coder, but she's sitting like 6 levels down in this organization. She sees managers above her who are kind of clueless on how value gets really created, who do not understand technically much of what's going on. She thinks she has some real insights into how to build a better product or serve the customer, or even how to improve the organization. What's your advice for somebody like Jennifer, who's thinking about how does she grow her sphere of influence, right? How does she make a bigger impact? How do these different tools, attraction, expansion, what kind of practical tips might you give to somebody in that situation?
So let's just give a little context for those strategies, because we're assuming that most of the people who will listen to this ever may not read the book. So I wanted to understand even though I think they should read the book, but they may not. So those 4 strategies you mentioned come from the elements of power in any relationship. So I have power over you if I have something that you need, and if you cannot get it easily elsewhere. And those 2 elements define the first 2 strategies. Attraction is making you more interested in what I have to offer, right? So that you need it and want it. That's strategy number 1 for Jennifer. So she has to persuade. So she's convinced that she has substantively something that people in her company could use that is valuable. But maybe she hasn't persuaded the right people that that's the case. So you need, assuming she's correct, because she might be wrong, right? She might not have something very attractive. In that case, you have to construct it. But if she does, the question is, who is the decision maker who you need to persuade of the value of this. And the value of a resource is in the eye of the beholder as much as it is substantive. We have wonderful examples of how, our perceptions of value or something is subject to manipulation, influence. That's another way to think about influence. So that's strategy number one. Who do you have to go and describe what you're doing in terms that will make them interested? So unpack where is the value? How am I going to see it realized? Then you have the second element. Can they get it elsewhere? And so the alternatives are fundamental. If you perceive that people like me, a dime a dozen, like there's a ton of you. So yeah, you have something good to offer, but I can get it elsewhere just as easily. I'm not going to be able to influence you much because you can replace me. So Jennifer's job is to say, well, I'm not that replaceable after all. And provided that the resource you have to offer is understood and appreciated, then the second strategy is consolidation. Maybe they think that they can pit people like you that offer the same resource against you. And say, well, I don't have to listen to you because I can get this from somewhere else. So the consolidation strategy is a strategy of reducing the number of alternatives for the other party in the power relationship. And it manifests in multiple ways. You can have a union where people like Jennifer coalesce and say, you cannot dismiss me personally, because as you dismiss me, you dismiss all of us of the same kind. Okay. And your example did not fit this strategy particularly well because she seems to have something truly unique and distinctive, as opposed to what happens often in a union or in another form of consolidation, which is like a cartel. All you offer is oil. That's all you're offering, and I create OPEC just to curtail your alternatives. So let's go to the second part of the power relationship, your power over me. So the power of the company over Jennifer. And once again, two elements. Do they have something she wants, and can she get it elsewhere? And the first option at her disposal is withdrawal, meaning maybe that's what you did when you were dating Gary. You showed less interest. And that increases your independence of somebody else because you are not as needy of them anymore because there's some other girl that you find interesting and or you decide actually you don't like girls at all, you prefer boys, and so the girl really has no attraction. So that's withdrawal. And the last one is expansion. So the expansion of the options. And, you put yourself out there in the Jennifer may have outside options. Say, I don't need to persuade this company to adopt my change. I don't need to do that because actually I found another company that gets what I want to do, appreciates what I want to do, and I can just go with them. Or I find another business unit in my company who gets what I want to do. I go over there. I create those linkages. I persuade the right people. And I disentangle myself from the tyranny of the stupid manager of mine that doesn't get it, that is blind, or the layers are just way too many. But I have a good contact over there where I can sell my idea more readily. Those are the options.
Can I just interrupt there for one moment, Tiziana? Because what I see in practice, particularly among kind of Gen Z workers who've grown up, in a world that is to them much less hierarchical online, and they have quite a different view of authority. What I see them is often adopting the withdrawal strategy. They're still taking the paycheck. They're there. By the way, this is endemic across all employees, which explains the very low engagement data. But they just kind of give up. They withdraw. And I don't know. I have a hard time mistaking that as power. I guess it's power in a way, but I think just as much withdrawal can be just a sense of kind of resignation. So, that, and kind of from the employee's perspective, expansion is also a strategy you see a lot where, they're looking for other alternatives. And that's why often you see, people switching employers because like I just give up, and we know the data that 50% of employees have changed jobs because of an incompetent or tyrannical boss. So the expansion and withdrawal to me sound more like kind of resignation than they do real ways of increasing my impact in that situation.
Well, it depends on the situation and what drives you to do the things you do. So let's take a more personal example. The Great Resignation that we are observing right now is coming from a lot of people
But
who
sorry, you just mean the fact that many people seem to have elected not to go back to work.
correct. They say,
Okay,
or
yes,
they're given job offers and they say no, thank you.
yeah.
And what's happening there? Well, a couple of things. One is more giving up, the way you were describing, maybe triggered by the pandemic and how it's made us rethink what matters. And maybe what matters is that I spend more time with my kids, or I don't let the tyrannical boss make my life miserable for those $10 an hour that you pay me. And I prefer to eat more beans and less meat than to have you boss me around and treat me like dirt. Okay, so it's a reshaping of what's valuable. That's withdrawal. Yeah, is it giving up? Yeah, some level, maybe it is, because you found no avenue to make that workplace any better. So you say, I'm not going to be in it. But there are other ways to think about withdrawal. Going back to OPEC and oil and gas producers, France did that in the 70s when the rest of the world was under the gun of the oil producers, including our country, Michele. You may not remember because maybe you're too young. But I remember when the price of oil went up so much that Italy was actually rationing the use of cars in the 70s. France did, you know what? We're going nuclear, meaning they switched to nuclear power. That's another form of withdrawal. You're not going to be captive of the power relationship. And even in the Great Resignation, we're observing some people who don't just decide, I'm not taking that crappy job. I am going to create my own job. I'm becoming an entrepreneur. That business producing that particular recipe of tacos that my grandmother did, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to make my living in a very different way. That's withdrawal too. And this is not a despair drawl. It's like, I say F you to those nasty employers, but at the same time, I'm creating my own, I'm molding my own existence.
But by the way, even that kind of despair withdrawal, I think, does have a power dynamic, because what you see, as you talked about the great resignation, Tiziana, is you see companies having to offer better conditions and better pay, right? They're on the back foot. I see them advertising now, you'll get the healthcare benefits from day one and so on. So, so for sure there is still a power dynamic. I think it might be quite difficult if the withdrawal is one person, but when you see many people say, like, we've had enough, there's certainly a power element to that.
That's right. And that's when the withdrawal and consolidation join, because now employers are not dealing with just one disgruntled dude. They're dealing with hundreds of thousands in their job market that refuse. And then they have to really change. You cannot replace them from one for the other because nobody is saying yes to you under those conditions. And so you lose them.
Well, Tiziana, all this talk of withdrawal makes me, I think, and we'll maybe come back to this later, about the strategies that companies we've mentioned in our book, like a Hire or others, do, which is they make sure that power is distributed and there are always multiple sources of provision for things you're interested in or you would like, so that they basically create. Handelsbanken does this as well with internal services, the Scandinavian bank, where there's no one has a monopoly on provision of a particular service, and therefore you always have the option to say F you, right? And you're never beholden to their their narrow priorities and so on, and that just creates a completely different way of rebalancing in relations and making power accountable. Maybe we could come back to that. How do you make power truly accountable, and in an institutional sense? But before we do that, I wanted to um, go back to something you said earlier, that power does things to people with power, right? And in the book, you mentioned that power makes people vulnerable to I think two traps, right? One is self-focus, right, and the other one is hubris, and that to guard against these, you need to cultivate humility and empathy, right? And now, humility and empathy have long been recognized as important qualities for real leaders and people with who exercise power responsibly. But they're also exceedingly rare, right? Among those people who have positional power. And I'm reminded of that Jim Collins's work, right, around level 5 leadership. I think he mentioned it in Good to Great. He surveyed 1,500 companies and found that only 11 CEOs of those 1,500 companies had the humility to be categorized as level 5 leaders in his framework. And so, like an infinitesimal portion of the sample included leaders who were humble. And in fact, if you look at the literature, narcissism is often more correlated with advancement than humility, right? So how do we create an environment where humility and empathy are the norm and not the exception in organizations? And how much of this, and sorry for the long question, it's kind of a two-barreled one, but how much of this should be up to the individual, and things that they need to do themselves, and what is required in terms of the institutional context, the systems and processes that need to be in place to kind of reinforce these traits.
Yes, it has to be a double-barreled question because it's a double-barreled answer that you already anticipated in your question. So there are things that belong in the domain of personal development that rely on our personal self-control and maturity and wisdom, and good luck to us if we rely only on those, because they're very difficult to accomplish unless you're a Buddhist monk. You often don't have those things. We often don't have those things. It's a constant struggle. So the second piece that you were mentioning, the systems and the processes that we put in place to help people be better, are critical. And they belong both in the domain of developing empathy and humility in people and in creating accountability systems that reinforce them. So, for example, I can help a leader develop a sense of empathy and therefore the capacity to understand the needs of others, without which you cannot lead them properly. You can coerce them, you can boss them around for a while until they have an opportunity to rebel, and they will, the moment they have a window. So what can you do? You can do what Microsoft has done. They have changed their performance rating approach. I'm sorry about my coughing. I don't have COVID. I know for a fact because I've been tested a lot recently. I have allergies to the flora of North America, which means that where I'm going to retire, right, Michele? In a place that has different flora. That's my need.
Just so it's not allergies to North Americans, that we would worry about.
No. I even married one, so that tells a lot about my affection for North Americans. But the flora is a different business. But what they did at Microsoft was to abandon the traditional performance rating in the performance review. What they do instead, they ask a few key questions. Two of them jump out at me. They ask the person who's coming up for evaluation, promotion, whatever, how has your work benefited the work of others here? And the flip side, how have the inputs and ideas and resources of others benefited your work? Those are questions that point at one thing and one thing only, the awareness of interdependence that we all should have to engage with others, because they don't become irrelevant the way the powerful person tends to think. If I had power, that means that I control the valued resources, right? I, by implication, conclude that I don't need you because I've got power, I got the resources. And when I think that I don't need you, I won't pay attention to you. I won't give a damn about you because you're not relevant to me. That is one of those traps. And this particular performance evaluation system is a way to address it, because it forces you to sit down and consider how relevant others are to you in what you do and what you accomplish, and how dependent on you they are. So, such that, as the great Martin Luther King Jr. would say, we're all tied in a single garment of destiny. If we become aware of this interdependence, we are so much less likely to treat people like expendable, substitutable, irrelevant, because you realize that you have this interdependence. So that's a systemic approach to developing empathy that doesn't rely on me as a wise woman in touch with my feelings, understanding that I should care about people. It doesn't rely on that. It just relies on our cultivating the sense that we're in it together. So when I see the examples in your book, I'm like, yes. I mean, one of the many, many things, and again, it's a constellation of interventions. You cannot just do one. And all of these companies you feature, they've done many, many things. And this is one of them, to this idea that we depend on each other. And then humility, the notion that I don't have all the answers. That's the other thing that power does to us. It makes us feel invincible. It makes us feel that we are in control. And therefore, I don't need input. I got it. And that's where you really deny the potential of others to help us collectively do something I cannot do by myself. Then you can institute that. You can measure how humble a leader is perceived to be by people. There are scales to measure that. Put it in your systems so that I, as a leader, every year, I get all these people telling me whether I actually behave like a humble person or I behave like an arrogant jerk. And if I get that input every year, I go, oh, MG, I had no idea that I come across like this. I think I'm pretty humble, which is a definition of lacking humility right there. But these are things you can institute.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Hire for underwriting the costs of producing this interview. Hire is the world's leading appliance company and also a global leader in the Internet of Things. For the last decade, Hire has been leading a remarkable revolution in management. It is proven that even the largest, most complex organizations in the world can be entrepreneurial at their core. Now, back to our conversation.
As you were talking, Tiziana, I was also reminded of what Bridgewater Associates does. They're one of the largest hedge funds in the world. They're founded. It is Ray Dalio. He wrote a wonderful book called Principles, and we talk about this in the book. They have this feedback mechanism called the dot collector, where during meetings or any interactions with colleagues, you're encouraged to give them a rating on the spot on particular characteristics, including, are you open-minded, are you flexible in your thinking, are you encouraging ideas and listen to other people and so on. And over the course of a year, you might get 2,000 ratings, 3,000 ratings, right? And it's just like an objective, or as objective as you can get in these situations, view of what your peers and your colleagues think of you along these characteristics. And it's real time. It's quite robust, and unfortunately, it's still an exception to the rule of evaluating people once a year based on some subjective input from one person, right? And as long Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm interrupting because I apologize, but feel free to do the same with me. Interrupt anytime you want. But this idea that even when people organizations do a more like 360 type, but they don't ask the right questions oftentimes, right? They don't ask questions that really matter to shape your behavior as a leader, as a manager. I don't go in the right direction. But I have a question for you guys that has been a burning question, and it's my chance to ask it. So these companies you have identified as just stunning in how revolutionary their approach is. I want to know who started it all, how they got there, because one of the processes that I think is quite necessary, and I know you're talking with a lot of CEOs, you're doing this educational work, right? In many ways, who were these people that came up with this, and what defining features or histories or trajectories they experienced that got them to this point? Because this is still, as Michele, you said, the exception rather than the rule. What's the genesis of an organization like that?
I think, Tiziana, it goes a little bit to what you were just talking about, and it's a very deep, I think, sense of how you look at other human beings. And I have to say, I'm a little bit skeptical at the extent to which you can nudge, socially engineer somebody into that point of view with instruments or feedback. I think you can to a degree. How much, though, I think is a bit of an open question for me. But I think in all of these cases, it's quite interesting. Most of these pioneers, they they didn't go to business school. They had somehow escaped this kind of instrumentalist view of other human beings as factors of production that you use to get things done, and they saw them instead as kind of agents. And I think they had this view that the role of an organization is not to maximize compliance, but it is to foster contribution. And you start from there and then say, okay, what kind of a system does that? But certainly in a lot of the folks that we talk to, and Michele mentioned Nucor, and they're probably the largest, most complex organization that's been going down this track. And regular listeners to this series might have heard me share this anecdote. But more than a decade ago, when I first met Zhang Rumin, who was their CEO, now CEO and chairman at Haier, he said, our goal is to let every employee become their own CEO because people are an end and not a means. And I think that's a fundamentally different view. The same thing if you listen to people at Nucor, this very progressive U.S. steel company, they will say that being a manager is the least noble role. That really we are just here to support and further the work of others, but there's no stature, there's no extra kind of kudos that go to you for being kind of a manager. Similarly, Birdsorg, this hyper flat 16,000 employee Dutch home healthcare organization with almost no bureaucracy at all. The founder there said when he started in 2006, Jos de Blok, he said our goal is humanity over bureaucracy. So I think there's almost a starting belief and that you take into your role as a leader, as a manager, whatever you call it, on how you see human beings, whether you see them as primarily instruments or not. And I think that that's one of the essential differences. Michele, what would you add to that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a completely different worldview and philosophy, as Gary mentioned, and the relationship between people and the institution. And in some cases, these were founders. Jos de Blok was a founder. He was actually a nurse in the Dutch public health system, and he got so tired of all the BS, that would just, administrative BS that was keeping them away from patients and solving their problems. They said, I'm just going to create my own organization to do this from the outside, and so I can start from scratch. So Gore, it was the same way. He was a founder. And in other cases, these are CEOs that embrace these ideas at a time of crisis. That was certainly the case for Ken Iverson at Nucor. I think you could also argue Jean Groumet at Hire when he took over. Hire was, in the 1980s, was not a high performing organization by any stretch. It was a municipally owned refrigerator making in a kind of second tier province of China, right? But they took the crisis as an opportunity to refashion the organization and reboot the organization. And so, these are, in a way, very inspiring cases, but at the same time, they are kind of edge cases, right? Because you basically need to find people that are enlightened and that have one or two things. They either are highly entrepreneurial and build something from scratch, or they find themselves in the right organization at the right time, and they're able to do the Control Alt Delete. And so then, the question now becomes, how do you evolve an organization, where you may not have this kind of a CEO? Because how many, it's like back to Jim Collins's level 5 leaders. Like, how many of these of them are there? And then how do you do this absent a crisis? How do you evolve the organization without, the organization being on the brink? And that's really the challenge ahead of us, I think. I don't know if we have some answers we can get into if you want, but that's really the where I think we'll have to focus on if we really want to move the needle.
Yes, and I actually think that a institutionalized model of personal development is the answer. Because it is personal development. As you said, these are uniquely enlightened individuals who have a different view of humanity, right? And here we are in a lot of societies where studying the humanities has become like, what an idiot you are for doing such things. Why would you engage with literature and poetry and the arts, and why would you want to do that?
And of course, there were no important books written before the year 2000 anyway.
That's right, exactly. Good thing ours were written after, hey? So we stand a chance of being read by somebody, even though people don't read very much. So in our book, we talk about the educational revolution that Scandinavian countries engaged in, in the mid 1800s, and they developed a model based on the Germanic idea of Bildung, but it became folk Bildung. So they brought this very comprehensive and almost not goal-oriented model of education to the people who were least likely to get it. The peasants in the countryside, and then the workers in the city factories. And this education was intended to develop the person wholly, meaning I'm going to give you the input you need to become a better farmer from a technical standpoint, but I'm also going to teach you about science and scientific reasoning so that you can process evidence and information, something that we need desperately in our world. But I'm also going to remind you of our humanity. And so you will read Shakespeare, you will read poetry, because that's when you understand. And that's when you understand yourself as part of something bigger than you. That awareness of interdependence starts to become a deep part of you. So you are given, number one, the trust that yes, you too, peasant, yes, you too, low, unskilled blue-collar worker can, which is the equivalent in many ways of the companies you describe. I mean, I love you starting the book saying, we talk about power dynamic. It's not a question of a lot of people with certain jobs becoming irrelevant. It's a question of how we make everybody's job relevant. So you lift up, you give exposure. The Scandinavian countries have done this very well. And so, yeah, they don't deal with everything well. They have their trouble with immigration and, ethnic and racial diversity. But they do way better than many, many others in terms of creating a harmonious society where people are engaged in civic work in the community because they understand the interdependence. They feel like they can. They are allowed, they're encouraged, and they have the capabilities. And if they don't have them, they can develop them. This is the magnificent development of that leader, the ephemeral leader, who is not afraid to give people a chance to speak up and come up with ideas. They're not insecure because they understand their role with others. I mean, we have to go back to the basics of education to achieve what you want to achieve, because otherwise we rely on those few albatrosses that thank God once in a while one appears. But as you said, Michele, they have to show up at the right time, under the right conditions, so that there are too many low probability events that multiply and they make it really, 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 really low probability that we'll see that kind of leadership. I'll stop here. My rant or my endorsement of the Nordic model. I'll stop here.
No. Well, I think obviously it's very complicated to unpack the Nordic model. They have a high degree of cultural homogeneity, which we know from a lot of research. That is one of the things that makes it. If you really are living in a multi-ethnic society, you must be much more intentional. It's a much bigger struggle to bring people together and keep them together, and you can't that doesn't happen automatically, and it's a constant struggle to do that. But yes, there's less social distance in those countries, between the elite and everyone else, which leads me to another question. And I want to quote a couple of things from your book, which I found both very true, but also I think quite disconcerting in a way, Tiziana. So here's what you said, and pardon me, I'm going to look down and just refer to my notes here, but this is what you said in the book. Allowing power imbalances to become so great that they undermine the legitimacy and the stability of our social and economic systems is not only morally objectionable, but also unwise on the part of the powerful. And then you go on to say, having said it's unwise to let those kinds of inequities, those imbalances get created, you go on to say, but it's also rare for the powerful to voluntarily relinquish some of their power, and that change must be driven by those lower in the hierarchy. And that seems immensely relevant to where we are right now, not only in the United States, but around the world, right? Whether it is a five-star movement in France, the in Italy, the Yellow Jackets in France, Brexit, and even if you think about the United States, a lot of people who felt quite hopeless, completely disempowered, lined up behind Trump a couple of times. A lot of young people who felt equally disempowered, lined up behind Bernie Sanders, both, Sanders saying, let's try socialism, Trump saying, let's drain the swamp, right? These are two fairly radical political poles, but both attracted together a majority of Americans who felt very dispossessed. And when you look at this data, it's compelling that a vast majority today, and this is across the majority of the developed world, a vast majority of ordinary citizens feel disenfranchised. A vast majority feel quite powerless as powers become more centralized, as I lose my share of voice. And I think that is dangerous for social cohesion. It is easily exploited by people in power to set us against each other. But and often it does end in a kind of revolution. And you talk about some of these things, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, you could add the Tea Party movement or Extinction Rebellion and so on. But it often seems that the powerful, the elite, are quite capable of co-opting those kind of would-be revolutions. So, the last third or so of your book, you talk about how you make things happen when you don't have a lot of form of power, and you talk about the need to agitate and innovate and orchestrate. But I'm wondering, what advice do you give today to people on both sides of the political divide who feel completely disenfranchised, who feel, and again, we know this data, it's unimpeachable, it's from Gallup, it's from Edelman, it's from Pew. A majority of people now think the system is run for the few rather than many. You have distinguished economists like Joseph Stiglitz saying, large corporations now are basically rent seekers and are using their political power. So a lot of people feel very disenfranchised. And my hope would be that they find in your book a kind of positive recipe for making, a positive difference rather than this feeling of hopelessness or being vulnerable to calls from the extremes, which are, I think, are probably dangerous, whether they come from the extreme left or the extreme right.
Well, we have a lot to unpack here, rightfully so. So one piece of the argument is to speak to the powerful and point out to them the deleterious effects of hoarding power and leading so many to feel disenfranchised. And because there are all these consequences that are very well documented, there's economic consequences for the system as a whole. Yes, the powerful may get a larger piece of the pie, but the pie shrinks when you have so many who are not included in the game, so to speak. There are social consequences you just described, unrest, the sense of hopelessness that leads people to do desperate things. And just the health of the system, literally, the physical health of the system deteriorates. So the idea being, let me point out to you, powerful person, that while you may enjoy appropriating all these rents, as economists would say, for a chunk of time, you are exposing yourself and others to horrendous consequences. And the climate is the most blatant. You have a lot of people who have accumulated riches exploiting our environment. And here we are now facing the possibility of not having an environment that is livable for us, including the powerful and the rich. Okay, so it comes back to haunt you, so to speak. And then you have the reaction of the powerless. That, can, as you described, can be. So what we want to make clear in this book, that all of these populist movements that can be very deleterious are predictable if you run your system in a certain way. So of course you get people that are voting for Brexit. Of course you get people that are voting for Trump, because you led them to the point where they don't see a way forward for themselves. And they are very...
Can I just caution? This is not just the problem of the right.
No,
you
no,
also
yeah,
have
yeah.
right now in the United Kingdom, 2/3 of young people believe that socialism, they have no experience of socialism, but they believe that is superior to capitalism. And there's no evidence on which to base that belief. And for sure, capitalism is underperforming and broken in many ways. But I think on left or right, you both become vulnerable to to ideas that speak to emotionally, that speak to your pain, but may be quite destructive in ways. So I just want to say, I think it's a mistake to think about this as just a matter of populism on the right. It can be right or left, and it is.
But there are populism movements that are lefty in their approach. And I agree. They share some of the similarities. So what we would like to see is for people to understand this dynamic. Understand why certain arguments made by certain leaders become appealing even when they don't have substantive rationale or any evidence for being effective in the long run. But they become appealing because they speak to deep needs of ours that for many, 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 many people have been absolutely thrown in the garbage. I would like people to get that so that they can see through those arguments better. Don't let them sway you in directions that are, in fact, even more destructive than the direction you're in right now. So from my point of view, I see this as an education of the general public as much as of the ones who are currently in power, both to see the consequences of allowing these great discrepancies that, by the way, emerge naturally. Power and its distribution follow what physicists, mathematicians call a power law. What does it mean? That naturally they tend to concentrate in the hands of a few over time. Even when you start off with a fair system, even when you start off with absolutely equal distribution of resources, over time, in the winning or losing of life, some people pick up a little bit of an advantage, and that feeds onto itself. And we saw this with the internet. My goodness, you start off with an innovation that was intended by its creators to spread resources to all. It was the ultimate exercise in power for all. I'm going to give knowledge and information freely to everybody who wants it. You start like that. And then you have a few early winners who have the, it's luck, it's inventiveness, it's the genius of the creator, of the innovation. And they have a platform to acquire more resources. And then you have all the twists and turns of how capitalism unfolds. And we have a profoundly unequal system, right, that generates. So that is a natural tendency. And what we're trying to say in this book, in those last few chapters you're mentioning, is that when we don't understand this dynamic, it is self-reinforcing, and we allow it to take hold, we generate a whole lot of dysfunction. And so what is a citizen going to do? One, assess the wannabe leaders along the right criteria. Sometimes they're hard to measure in a political leader or a business leader. I don't know. Are you humble and empathic? I don't know. I know you're competent, Gary, because I know your work, but I don't know you as a person. So should I put you as a leader of my organization? I have no idea. So it's hard to actually gauge who we're giving our vote to. But we often don't even use the right criteria. Forget the fact that we cannot measure them. We look at the leader that looks strong, that it looks like he's going to come. I'm going to say he because that's often what, the gender or the wannabe leader that is going to come and protect us, is going to come and save us from all of these abusers. You shall not be forgotten anymore because here I am looking out for you and making your group look good and strong and better. And we buy that. And it's like, the first thing you got to do is not buy that. First thing. And then we can talk about everything else, right? And whether it's linear left, linear right, or centrist and moderate, and they're all based on power sharing. All the good models are based on not allowing that discrepancy to take hold. Because it will. It always does. If it's not stopped, curbed, governed. And we as citizens have to be engaged enough. We as members of an organization have to be engaged enough to recognize that. And that's why I like the Nordic model, because it created a model of engagement with these issues. So that people feel like, of course I'm participating in this decision. Of course I am listening. I am hearing. I am paying attention, and I'm voicing. Of course, that's what we do. That, to me, is the right governance system.
One thing. Let me build on that, and I think that's a clarion call, Tiziana, to to resist the extremist voices who want to who have that kind of strong man view, and it usually is a man, as you said. We need to resist that, I think, and be very wary of that. The other thing, though, I see is this, and I just be curious to get your perspective on this. One of the things, because I think you're 100% right. You talk in the book about how, power was more concentrated perhaps 1,000 years ago than it is now. But I would say not much, right? When you look at income equality, when you look at industry consolidation, when you look at how power has moved from state authorities to national to supranational authorities, And in fact, I know this is a very crude index, but if you look at the declining trust, well, let me just say this. In the United States, people have very high levels of trust in local government and almost no trust in federal government, right? Likewise, they have very high trust in small business, almost no trust in big business. And I don't think this is irrational, right? By definition, when power gets centralized, I have less chance to influence the policies. My voice is a much smaller fraction. And so it's, and likewise, the policymakers know much less about my situation, are much likely to create policies that are right, recognizing that the world is not all the same and there are all of these very deep local variances. So I don't think it's an accident that as institutions, the US government, the EU, corporations, as they become more centralized, it's almost a one-to-one correlation. We've tried to measure this. Trust has gone down. And so one of the things I really wonder, you talk about power in this expansive sense, but I also think of kind of hard power and soft power, which is familiar, in geopolitics. But the hard power of bureaucratic power, where I have legal rights to hire, to fire, where I have, positional authority to do certain things, and you really don't get even a vote in that, or the administrative authority that you find in the administrative state, which is vast and hard for anybody to challenge. I wonder whether that the soft power of let me organize, let me get a group together, let me try to change this, it just seems sometimes almost too asymmetric, that it's not about just finding groups that can challenge us, but maybe collectively we have to think about how do we roll some of this top-down authority, how do we roll that back in a way, and how do we try to create more localism and more opportunity for people to solve problems where they are? Because I just have a sense that the dynamic you described so well, that powerful people are often in a position to get more power, that we have to somehow reverse that ratchet now. And I don't know what the mechanism for doing that is. I hope that you're right, that somehow the Greta Thunbergs of this world and others, can stimulate us, we can organize. But so often these movements get co-opted or they get overrun. But I have to say, I think your book gives me some hope. It gives me some hope that there's a way of thinking about this. There's a way of mobilizing, doing it in a productive way. And I can say, never more do we need that set of ideas than right now.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right, and I like that. I like very much what you're saying about this decentralization of the system that doesn't require a social movement that is grassroots, the way the movement for LGBT marriage in Argentina, right? That was very much grassroots, because those are painfully difficult to do. As you correctly point out, sometimes they get appropriated and weaponized in direction that were never intended by the founders. So they are complicated. What we talk about also is the idea of true participation. So when you say local government, in that community, in that place, in that town, in that company, in that business, are people participating in the decision making, in the coming up with ideas? And there are political systems that allow that better than others. So where they have this combo of, there's both a centralized, you can call it bureaucracy, but it's a system, but there's a lot of opportunity for people to chime in and voice. And there are, for example, Taiwan now is going through what it's going through, but they had wonderful experiments in community-based decision-making. So it's a democracy it's a democratic system, political system, but that creates all kinds of different avenues for local decision-making and participation. The Nordic countries, very much the same way. It's a system. You're not requiring people to create a social movement, which is so painful to do. Some people often pay a high price for pouring their whole lives in that direction. Greta is not leading the most cheery life. Okay, it's actually hard to be Greta. I feel for that poor girl. And she feels for herself sometimes. She's saying, it's like, I shouldn't be doing this. I should be in school, studying, doing my thing. Why do I have to do all of this stuff? That's what social movements ask of people.
But what you're saying, Tiziana, and I want to turn back to Michele, but and I think this is very, very important. You're saying don't underestimate the power of grassroots, activism and so on. That that we need to rely on that. We need to hope there's more of that. But you're saying really what we need is enlightened leaders who understand that this that we've built in things that are not sustainable. We've built in disequilibria that are not sustainable, inequalities that are not sustainable. And within the structures we have now, some of them need to change, but we have to legitimize more voice, more participation, more influence. And certainly in the work that Michele and I have done in organizations, we are using technology to enable that. So rather than waiting for strategy to get set at the top, or waiting for somebody to say a senior executive to say this policy needs to change, there's all the time, real time, company wide conversation where people can weigh in on all of this, and others can comment and build and suggest solutions. But where there's an avenue and a structure and something productive to do that, and you don't need the patience of Job and the courage of Richard the Lionhearted to actually make something happen, which is asking a lot.
That is exactly right. We think of it as a democratization of our organizations and our systems of government at a more macro level. So that you see why I love your book, because this is a book about democratizing work. And my co-author, Julie Battilana, has actually launched an entire initiative called Democratizing Work that really wants to find ways to design systems where participation of this kind that you just described becomes the norm, and it doesn't scare the leaders away, that they reject it for fear of what will happen if you let workers chime in, if you let them be represented, if you let them take the initiative, if you give them autonomy. We're facing this now with the return to work, so to speak, where some leaders, some companies understand that giving employees a level of autonomy in deciding what work arrangements allow them to do their best work is the way to do it. And you have a whole lot of others who are scared about letting an employee decide for themselves. Should I work from home? Should I today? How about tomorrow? Should I meet with my team virtually? Should we get together? Should we get together in the park? Should we get together in the office? All of those micro decisions are very, very hard for some leaders to understand as fundamental conduits of autonomy that leads to the energies you want people to contribute. But we haven't necessarily persuaded enough people of this, and I think it goes back to very deep exposure of cultural values. And I think that we have very hierarchical societies and very classist societies where you really, really end up thinking that power is a zero-sum game, and that's what we have to reverse, that logic. And I think your work with Michele does that very, very well. We are adding our bits to that. And maybe together, if we keep talking.
More than a bit. It's an immensely important contribution. Michele.
Well, I was hoping to ask you a question back to, what do we need to do inside of organizations to prevent concentrations of power, right? So assume that someone like a CEO or, the investor of CEO of a Fortune 500 company, or the investor with a controlling stake or a big stake in one of these large companies comes to you and says, I read your book, I love it, I want to create an organization where these kind of power asymmetries don't exist, where wherever there is, concentrations of power start to grow, we cut them down, right? And what do I need to do? So, and assume that we'll have a good program to instill the right virtues in our people and so on. But structurally, Tiziana and Julie, what would you want me to do? Like, what should I change in how decisions are made and how processes are run and how authority gets distributed and so on. Like what would be like the top 2 or 3 changes structurally you would make to an organization to have power be much more diffused and much more accountable?
Right. And I like the idea of making much more diffuse, because the idea of a perfectly equal distribution of power is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. What matters is to not allow the discrepancy to grow so wide that then power abuse becomes more likely, and power misuse becomes more likely. Okay, so that's the logic, the rules we're going. So many things have to change. But you're asking me to identify the few. One is decentralization, where decision-making power is allowed to invest every area of every nook and crane of the organization. And this is one of the reasons why I find your book so very helpful, because you describe in great detail what it looks like to do it in practice. So for the skeptical business leader who goes like, okay, well, but when I reduce to decentralize, you lose control over what people do. Well, that's because you haven't done your job well. You have not really given people the feedback they need to know how they're doing. You haven't given them the general direction, the general purpose, so they know how to direct their energy, what they're trying to aspire to. But once you've done those two things, decentralizing the decisions that allow those people to contribute to that higher goal, higher purpose, is something that is absolutely part and parcel of how things have to evolve. The second thing that I want to describe that speaks not only to creating less bureaucratic, stale, rigid, and power-concentrated organizations, but it speaks to inclusion in the sense that everybody talks about and nobody does, or very few do. You have to give the most valued resources more equitably to people. So if I have a great new client that can really push the organization to innovate, to do better things, who gets to work on that? Who gets to do it? And it tends to be the usual suspect, the usual people that always get it. And because our professional growth as individuals depend dramatically on the experiences that we get to have. I need to be able to, the infamous stretch assignment, people need them. And what you describe in your cases are organizations that give stretch assignments constantly to people. Not only do they give them the decision, so by giving the decision-making power, they allow them to stretch. And that's what growth is made of. Those are the two pillars of any attempt to reduce this power concentration and do and I started to sound trite or cheesy, but the unleashing of human potential. It is exactly that. Those are the two fundamentals. But I think, Michele, going back to the point earlier, I really think that we need to develop the person who leads into a more secure person in their capabilities and what they contribute and who they are. Because a lot of this reluctance to decentralize, to give people power, comes from you being damn shaky in yourself. That you need to self-aggrandize, you need to protect yourself from these perceived threats. And though that's a very personal type of development, and that requires a lot of meditation and a lot of therapy for some people.
Right. Well, Tiziana, you teach at a business school, and so is it almost can it be done at that level, or is it almost too late? And you have to work at these kinds of virtues in K through 12, right? Because yeah, because I mean, so the one issue is we're not teaching the right things in business school, and you always hear that, and it drives me crazy, especially around it's all about like your life hacks and optimizing your productivity. If you wake up or at the same time every day, you'll achieve more. But like, why do you want to achieve more? There's never that broader question that I think you'd like to kind of raise, like in education, like what is a good life, what is a virtuous career look like, or and all those issues, they're not even getting handled. But I wonder, is there hope to doing this in business schools, or do we need to intervene in other ways?
Well, the sooner the better, obviously, because you catch people when they're still being developed. But I think there's room for it in business schools. I mean, I know executives that are doing it, that they are actually embracing new models, who would say that we have to get rid of business schools altogether because we're teaching the wrong things. I have people that say universities have to change completely. That you actually what you're training people in. I've heard Adam Grant say this when I interviewed him, the way you're doing now with me about his book, Think Again. When I asked him, what is the one thing, if the nasty question that you ask at the end, when somebody's supposed to say one thing and one thing only that they care about. And he said the one thing I would like to think again is education at all levels. And university education in particular, saying what we really should be aiming for is develop moral character, he said, which is another label for what we've been discussing.
I think that's very interesting, Tiziana, because I had that thought the other day, is that in all the debate we've had over kind of what's wrong with society, what needs to be fixed, the idea of character, you hear very little about that. And yet I wrote a book back in 2012 called What Matters Now, coming kind of after the kind of financial crisis. And I had a whole section on this because what you could see in that crisis was a hole in the soul of capitalism. You had the most powerful actors in the capitalist system at the peaks of these financial institutions, who were, I don't want to say all of them, it's a gross overstatement, but many seem to be utterly disconnected kind of ethically from the impact of their decisions. And they were quite happy to privatize all the gains, socialize all the losses. And I think, anybody from Adam Smith onward who's commented about what makes capitalism work, they start with, you need an ethical and moral foundation. If that is missing, simply you get the worst excesses without the benefits. So it's very encouraging Adam would say that, and thank you for sharing that as well, because that seems to me very important to be willing to have that conversation.
That's right, and I think that the people who are showing the way in terms of how we should understand business and the contribution of business to the human experience and human fate, honestly, because that's what at stake right now for our children and the children's children. They're saying exactly this. I heard an interview of Zita Cobb, is a person who created this in one of the remote islands in the Atlantic provinces of Canada. That is uber sustainability and embeddedness with the community. And this is a place where you would never think you could do anything, because these islands, were based entirely on fisheries of cod. And when that kind of went down, they lost everything, all resources that you would think. And here she comes. She has a business background. She did the whole business thing. And now she's saying that it's a reconceptualization entirely of the values that should drive all of our enterprises. And business schools have done actually a terrible job of indulging a certain way to think about what's the point of business, what's the point of the economic enterprise. And here we have, in my own school, but many other schools, great focus on finance. It's fine and dandy. It can be useful. But for a lot of people, it becomes just a way to make money fast. And that's it. So the moral texture of all of that is nowhere to be found for a lot of people. But here's a hope. Not only people as Zita Cobb that tell us we have to either get rid of all business schools or redo them. And I think you can intervene at this level. These people come in their mid-20s. There are things you can do. But it's also this, the hope that I get when I see more and more students come to a business school and they mean it. They actually want to do better. They actually care about sustainability. They're shocked that we don't teach more of it. They look at us like, what is the matter with all y'all? That you're not? What's going on? So they push, and they believe in social change and in social entrepreneurship, and they are actually embracing those things in a way that even 10 years ago, I did not see nearly as often. So yes, I do see some hope, but we have to get on it because we don't have much time to do better. That's my only fear, that we are quickly running out of time.
All right. Well, on that hopeful note, Tiziana, thank you so much, not only for writing the book, but also for talking to us about this and so many other topics during this conversation, which is very extensive. And I love the fact that you kind of home in on like very essential, very deep things that we need to work on because that's where we need to operate at that very fundamental level, given the problems we face, as opposed to cosmetic changes on the surface. So thank you for that, and I look forward to reading more about you and Julie and your work and your progress in the world. Thanks.
Likewise, it was a delight to speak with both of you. Excellent questions that allowed us to go to many, many places that are important, and also explore the synergies between your work and ours that are many, and we can only hope to help each other along this path.